Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this lecture series already, and you all seem like you could use a break. So, we're going to talk about something a little bit lighter, something I've been reading up on over the last few years, and which I've been trying to wrap my head around, although I'm going to be honest with you and say that even the people that claim to understand it are going to admit that they don't really understand it. I am, of course, talking about quantum physics. Okay, so I'm not going to lecture you on quantum physics, though I do want to encourage you all to think about why a marketing researcher like myself would take the time to try to learn about a field like this. Part of the job of a marketing researcher is to be curious, and another part of our job is to try to relate what we're learning through data analysis to the world around us. For me, that means reading about very scientific and mathematical fields and trying to understand how the world really works by examining the underpinnings of scientific inquiry. Quantum physics has proven to be to the scientific world what our modern understanding of our solar system and the galaxy around us and universe around us is to geocentrism. It's a completely different way of seeing things that makes the behavior of the physical world much more complex than we could ever have imagined. And one of the reasons for that is that quantum physics says that electrons aren't just particles, they're also waves. And we can't describe the position of these particles precisely at any point in time. We can only measure things in terms of probabilities. One of the neat things about quantum physics is that it opens up the universe to be a far more interesting place than we ever could have imagined. Because what happens at levels far smaller than we could ever see has a huge impact on the makeup of things larger than we can comfortably comprehend. There's a reality bending perspective involved in thinking about how quantum mechanics work, and that's even led to ideas like the existence of a multiverse. Particles in quantum theory are governed by randomness, and that outcome of their behavior seems to be governed by something that we call the observer effect. Now, I want to be clear in saying that the observer effect is greatly misunderstood by us non-physicists because it's an analogy for something that makes sense in mathematical language used to describe the universe, but which is difficult to understand in our conversational language where analogy has to suffice. The observer effect is meant to describe a universe in which things happen, and we are around to observe them, not a universe where our eyes have some magical power that cause particles to behave differently because they're being watched. With that said, though, the very fact that we are present and observing things does have an effect on the universe around us, and our conscious choices do have an impact on the physical world, however slight it might be. The basic idea of the observer effect is that in order to take a measurement of something, we have to change the universe around us to do so. For example, if you air up your tires on your car and you want to check the pressure, you use a tool that allows you to detect the force of the pressure at the stem, but it also tends to let a tiny amount of air out in the process, deflating your tire ever so slightly and giving you a measurement that isn't entirely accurate. By observing your tire pressure, you also change it. Another example might be taking the temperature of a glass of water. In order to do so, you need to insert a thermometer into the glass. But since you don't know the temperature of the water or the thermometer beforehand, you also don't know what impact the thermometer has on cooling or warming that glass before your reading is taken. The effect might be ever so slight, but it does have an impact. And this observer effect holds true in so many other respects in social science as well. And one very well-known phenomenon is called the Hawthorne effect, which is used to describe a series of experiments from the Hawthorne works in Chicago in the 1920s and 30s that varied the amount of light inside the factory to see what impact it had on workers' productivity. And what was interesting was the employees, who did know they were part of the experiment, tended to perform better and better as the light was optimized. And once the experiments were over, they went back to being as productive as they were originally. What's really interesting about the Hawthorne effect is that it says that when people know they're being deliberately observed, they tend to unconsciously behave better. And when they're no longer under observation, any short-term gains disappear. In this case, they knew that they were being observed for the study, and as soon as they weren't being observed under the study, their productivity was right back to where it was before. Light had nothing to do with it. And this has been hugely challenging for social science because it's especially when it's centered around optimizing productivity, because the very nature of observing people makes them behave differently than they might otherwise. I also want to note that there's been considerable debate about whether or not the Hawthorne effect is actually a true phenomenon, but it does make sense intuitively when you think about it. And many researchers strive to work around it by limiting the impact of research subjects being aware of observation because of the impact it might have. Sometimes just the perception of being observed by others changes behavior. Let's say during a class session, I leave the room for 5 minutes and I give you all an assignment to work on. You might spend the whole time doing that assignment, but you might also want to talk or mess around on your phone or get up and go to the bathroom or any number of things. But let's say I told you I had a hidden camera in the room and I was going to leave it running. Just the thought that you might be observed would make you behave differently, even if I was lying about the camera. And if you thought I was lying and you weren't actually being observed, you would also behave differently as well. Now let's consider the context of conducting marketing research. Let's say you want to study how customers tend to walk when they head into a big box store like Walmart or Target. You can find this out by standing in front of the store and making a record, which means your physical presence may have an impact on where they choose to go, since they may see you and change their behavior as a result. You could also use cameras to watch them, but the cameras might change their behavior as well, especially if they're visible. Even hidden cameras might change their behavior if they somehow feel like they're being watched. And in fact, they already subconsciously know they're being watched by other people, by security cameras, and by store employees, so their behavior is already being impacted by that observation as well. If you were to try to isolate all of this behavior by allowing the customer to go into the store alone with no cameras, no other people to watch, and no recording, they would almost certainly behave differently as a result. And even if they suspected they were being observed, or if they were required to tell you what they did when they emerged, their behavior would change as well. This observer effect is tremendously important for us to understand because no matter what our intentions may be, the very act of observing someone makes them behave differently. We're all social animals and we have a desire to please other people with our behavior. We also have a well-known tendency during experiments and observational exercises to want to please our experimenters. And there are even other effects, such as the Rosenthal effect, which is also known as the Pygmalion effect, where we try to perform better to fulfill high expectations. Or there's the novelty effect, where we behave differently in a new context, such as in using new technology because we're encountering something new. And if you're interested in this topic, there are entire fields of study devoted to topics like social facilitation, reflexivity, self-determination theory, and other ideas that touch on how our behavior is impacted by the presence of observers. I could spend an entire class talking about one of those fields and still not manage to scratch the surface. They go very deep and have a profound impact on how we might think about changing human behavior. But what I will say is that whether we're observing tiny particles, physical phenomena, or human beings, our role as an observer plays a role in the outcome of our experiments. It's up to us as researchers to carefully consider those rules and ensure we minimize our impact on what we're observing. And as we're going to discuss in our next lecture, observational research is a powerful field of qualitative study that can yield a lot of valuable data, provided that we as researchers don't taint those data with the bias we introduce by being observers and interpreters of human behavior.